Hi there everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a quick video on the first ever modern Olympic Games in 1896. So I'm going to go over how they initially started, the different events that happened, the opening and closing ceremonies, and a little bit about the athletes and everything else as well. So I'm going to get started with a little bit of a quick introduction to what the ancient games actually were, when they started, and also why they stopped. So the first documented ancient Greek Olympic Games was in 776 BCE, before the Common Era, which was about nearly 3,000 years ago. And it consisted of initially some foot races and a really big party, and this was all to celebrate the ancient Greek god Zeus. Now, the ancient games later grew into like a big event that was bringing in people from all different city-states. There was more athletic events like the javelin, wrestling, and discus that were introduced, and it even became a time of armistice during different wars between different nation states. Now, in 393 CE, which is the Common Era that we are in now, Roman Emperor Thaddeus I actually banned the ancient Greek games as a part of a Christian campaign against paganism in the area. Now, and at the time, the ancient Greek Olympics were essentially a celebration of strength and skill for Zeus, who was a pagan god. There was also lots of things where in the ancient games, they all competed naked, so it was a bunch of men, nakedly wrestling and running around. There's also a lot of like debauchery and obscenity, and there was lots of parties and drugs and that sort of thing. So it wasn't very Christian. So he decided to kind of cut them, stop them, and that kind of ended the ancient games until the first ever modern Olympic Games in 1896. So we're going to fast forward to 1863, when a man named Pierre de Coubertin was born. He was born in Paris to an aristocratic and wealthy French family. Then he was very well educated in his youth with things like classical history, where he initially heard about the ancient Olympics, about physical education, law, politics, business, that sort of thing. So as he's growing up, there's a lot of stuff that is happening in France at the time, including the Franco-Prussian War, which France lost, and then that leads to a couple other really big political things like the Paris Commune, which was a small kind of socialist revolution. Then there was also the Third Republic in France, and then there was also the Dreyfus Affair, which really led to a lot of complicated politics and history in the nation that really kind of shaped a lot of what was happening at that time. So what Coubertin had seen in his youth really kind of shaped his view of France and his view of sport. And as I mentioned earlier, the ancient Greek games were actually used on occasion as an armistice between warring city-states. So he eventually takes his education, his love for physical activity and sports, stuff that was going on in France at the time, and there's a couple other things involved there as well, but he brings them all together and decides to restart the Olympic Games. So in 1894 in Paris, he and a few members create the International Olympic Committee, which starts trying to organize hosting a new Olympic Games. So initially, they weren't too sure where they were going to hold them. A lot of people suggested going back to Athens, which is where the games initially started. And they got the okays from the Greek royal family, the Greek government as well, and eventually started organizing the Olympic Games of 1896. Now, initially, Coubertin didn't actually want the games to happen in Athens. He didn't think that they would be able to, create a games up to his standard or were considered acceptable for such a big international event like this. However, a lot of money came from different Greek entrepreneurs and the Greek royal family, but they eventually made it work. And also at this time, they were organizing another games to happen afterwards in 1900 in Paris. So to the games. They were held from April 6th to April 15th and had 43 of individual events in 9 different sports, including athletics, cycling, fencing, gymnastics, shooting, swimming, tennis, weightlifting, wrestling, and there's sailing in there as well. And so there were 14 different nations that brought over 241 athletes, all of whom were male and all of whom well, most of them were considered amateurs in their sport, as in they didn't get paid for competing, and they also were there just because they loved the sport and they loved competing in it, that sort of thing. The nations that came together consisted of Australia, Austria, Bulgaria, Chile, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, and the US. And at this games as well, there weren't a lot of what we call professional athletes today. At this time, the idea of a professional athlete wasn't really a thing. And also it was a little bit taboo if you were being paid in order to compete in some form of physical activity. So people who would box kind of late at night and betting rounds illegally, that wasn't considered true sport because they were getting paid as opposed to just enjoying it. So that also begs the question, where were all the women at these games? So in the old ancient Olympics, women were actually not allowed to compete, nor were they allowed to be in the stadium. And if they were caught, they would have been executed or stoned to death. Now, Coubertin kind of followed this similar thing, minus the death and the stoning, but he disallowed women from competing because he considered their addition to the games as impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and incorrect. Now, yes, he did actually say that. However, women would compete in the next Olympic Games in 1900. And as for the opening ceremonies, they weren't the big kind of spectacular event that we see today. It basically consisted of about 60,000 Greek spectators who watched King George I of Greece and his wife Olga wave. They listened to speeches, they had a really big band singing some songs and a choir, and there was poets reciting their work, and all the athletes just kind of hung out together. The event was actually very popular in Greece, and that's where most of the spectators and athletes actually came from. But not a lot of people from outside or Europe kind of came in to watch the games because they weren't really, I guess, that big of a deal at this time, and people weren't really interested. Also, it was pretty hard to get all the way from, let's say, the UK to Greece at this time. So for the first sport, I'm going to start with athletics. So all the athletic events and most of the other events were held in the Panathenaic Stadium, which was originally built in 330 BCE to hold the ancient Olympics. And the stadium had kind of been lost for a while, but was only recently excavated in 1870 and had been restored by one of those wealthy Greek entrepreneurs that helped start the games. Now, at the games, the US dominated the track and field events, winning 9 out of 12 of them. One American, James Conley, won the triple jump, and he got a second in the high jump and a third in the long jump. You could say it was a jack of all jumps, or at least a very, very good jumper. Another American, Thomas Burke, used the now standard crouch position for starting some of his races. And this actually really confused the judges because most people just started standing up at this time. They actually had to stop the race, talk about it, and then decided that, okay, maybe it was okay for him to continue with this uncomfortable position to start his race. He ended up winning a few medals, so it obviously worked out for him. So the highlight of the athletics division, and by far the highlight of the entire games, was the marathon, which made its international debut at the Olympics. Now, the idea of the marathon comes from an ancient Greek legend where a man named Phidippides ran from a place called Marathon to Athens to announce the defeat of the Persian army in 490 BCE. Now, from Marathon to Athens, it was about 40 kilometers long. And they essentially just took all the athletes, dropped them off in Marathon, and used the same route that Phidippides could have taken on his journey to get back there. And actually the gold medalist for this event was Spyridon Lewis, who was a Greek, and he became a national hero after this event. So the next one I'm going to talk about is weightlifting. So there were only 2 events, or 2 individual sports in this category. One of them was called the one-handed lift, and the other was called the clean and jerk. And these were also just outside in a field, and there was actually no weight limits involved. Now, weightlifting wasn't something that was very popular at this time. It wasn't considered like a pure sport. It was just people picking things up and putting them back down, and people did that on a regular basis, so it wasn't really a sport thing to watch and enjoy. And this event actually looked a lot different than it does today. So the clean and jerk had about 7 people competing in it, but the medal was for Scotsman Launchin Elliott and Dane Viggo Jensen to take. They actually both lifted the same weight, but Jensen was declared the winner because Prince George of Greece liked Jensen's style more. It was based more solely on style than the actual weight. So, and this was actually due to a clause that was unknown to just about everyone at this event, that the member of the Greek royal family was able to pick whoever won in the event of a tie. So of course the Brits lodged a complaint saying, you know, we didn't know about this, it's not fair, we gotta let us try again. And eventually they did it again, and it led to the same result with Prince George picking Viggo Jensen anyway. But then for the one-handed lift, Launchin Elliott would win, and he defeated Jensen again. And Elliott was surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, he was incredibly popular with the Greek audience, and the Greeks considered him incredibly and very attractive. It's actually said that he was supposedly proposed to after a lot of his events by many Greek married or single wealthy women who wanted to keep him in Greece because of how attractive he was. So now I'm going to go on to gymnastics. So all the events were held in a field, and the other individual events included the horizontal bars, the parallel bars, the pommel horse, the rings, the vault, team parallel bars, team horizontal bars, and a rope climbing event. Yes, there is an Olympic record out there for climbing up a rope. So out of the nations represented, there was 1 Austrian, 1 Brit, 2 Hungarians, 11 Germans, and 52 Greeks. So the Greek gymnasts weren't actually that great. Germany actually won 5 out of the 8 events, including both the team parallel and team horizontal bars. I mean, quality over quantity. The Greeks didn't do very well, even though they put so many people into it. Now onto the rope climbing event, which I think is one of my favorite ever Olympic sports. They basically set up a 14-foot rope, and people climbed up it, and the judges considered their time and style of how to climb up the rope. 2 Greeks ended up coming in first and second, and then the 2 weightlifting champions who I mentioned earlier, Jensen and Elliott, came in 4th and 5th respectively. Now on to cycling. Frenchman Paul Masson won 3 of the 6 events. They also had a cycling marathon where they did the exact same thing. They dropped off the athletes and their bikes in marathon and told them to make their way back to Athens, and whoever came in first won. So German cyclist Adolf Schmal actually won the 12-hour event, which was essentially just, they gave you a course and they're like, okay, so let's see who can go the furthest, do the most in 12 hours. He ended up winning that one. Now I'm going to go on to the shooting events. So there were 5 of them. There were 2 rifle and 3 pistol events. Now at the games, 2 American brothers, John and Sumner Payne, finished 1st and 2nd in the military pistols and became the first siblings to win 1st and 2nd at the Olympic Games. And apparently, to avoid embarrassing their hosts, only Sumner participated in the free pistol event, and he ended up winning it by a bit of a margin as well. And this made him the first relative of an Olympic champion who is also an Olympic champion. I sound like someone who's doing like some form of sportscasting, you know, like LeBron James, the first person to make 8 left-handed consecutive shots while wearing white shoes while the moon is a waxing crescent. Any game of any sports, there are random facts just thrown out of all the different athletes because someone's got to be first to do absolutely anything. Anyway, the Payne brothers didn't actually compete in the 25 pistol event because the judges determined that the caliber of their weapons was not correct, even though there wasn't a caliber that was established for the games either. My guess is the Greeks were probably just a little bit embarrassed that they were losing. And for the remainder of the events, Greeks ended up taking the titles. Now on to fencing. So there were 4 fencing events: the épée, the foil, the saber, and the master's foil. The épée ended up just being canceled kind of for unknown reasons. And unlike in the other sports I've mentioned so far, there were actually some professional fencers who were allowed to compete at these games, but only in the Masters foil. Now, when I say professional, more likely these guys maybe gave lessons on fencing to other maybe like wealthy families, or maybe they competed kind of in like little duel matches, or they somehow got money from fencing. It wasn't like a professional sport they were doing. It's something they were doing on the side, but because they were getting paid, they were considered not amateurs, they were considered professionals. And for the next event, which is probably my favorite of this games, is the swimming competitions. Now, the swimming competitions were held in the Bay of Z, which is on average about 15 degrees in April. They decided that a swimming pool was too expensive, so they're like, hey, we got a bay with relatively calm water, let's throw these guys in April and just see who wins. And just to give you some context here, the regular average temperature of a pool is about 25 to 28 degrees, so it was cold, very cold. Now, all the swimmers were actually taken out by boat into the Bay of Z and essentially just dropped off at the required distance, and all the events were held consecutively after one another, just over and over and over again. So 2 of the 4 events were actually won by Hungarian Alfred Hájó. Apparently Hájó later confessed that his will to live completely overcame his desire to win. Of course it did. He probably would have died of hypothermia if he went any slower. The more comical event swimming entry was the 100-meter sprint that was only for Greek Navy sailors. Now 11 entered, but only 3 actually got in the water, and the winning time is actually about a minute slower than the regular 100-meter that they did. They would never do an event like this again, pretty obvious reasons. That's not that great. So the next one, sailing and rowing, they did have these events scheduled, however they couldn't get boats there or something, or they didn't have the proper equipment, so they ended up just canceling all the events anyway. So tennis was also played at the games, and it had a men's singles and a men's doubles event. And at this time, tennis was a really popular sport throughout Europe. However, none of the top players in the world came to the games and competed. And this is due to a few things. Some of them were professionals, so they weren't actually allowed to compete anyway. But also at this time, the Olympics wasn't really like an established, big event to go to. So a lot of these guys decided to go to other events and compete, or had other things going on, different tournaments, different cups, that sort of thing. So they decided to go to them instead, and finally it was a little bit more difficult to get to Greece at this time, so that's why a lot of people didn't travel there, especially spectators. Now in the men's singles, Irish John Boland won, and he actually also later entered the doubles event with the guy that he beat to win, German Frederick Tron, and they ended up winning the doubles together. So John Boland won both the men's single and the men's double. So John Boland was actually from Ireland, and at this time he was, he was under the Union Jack. He was there competing for Great Britain. That was due to the fact that Great Britain owned Ireland at this time and wouldn't, give them independence for another couple of years. So this makes John Boland not the United Kingdom's first tennis champion in men's and singles, but actually Ireland's. So the last event I'm going to talk about is wrestling. Now this one was just kind of a free-for-all. There were no weight classes, there was only one event, and it was kind of like a, you beat them or you don't tournament to move on. There wasn't really any rules, if not a lot. It was just held on like dirt ground, and they're like, okay, go for it, see who wins. It looked, if there's anything to compare it to, it looked a lot like Greco-Roman wrestling. Now, so a lot of the competitors in wrestling had actually also competed in previous events, like our Scottish heartthrob, Launchin Elliott. In the final, he faced off against German Karl Schumann and eventually lost, and a lot of the rich Greek ladies were really, really sad about that too. So with that, that's all the athletics that happened at the games. And as for the closing ceremonies, they were very similar to the opening ones. They consisted of a big banquet. King George I gave a bunch of more speeches, and all the awards were given out at this event as well. So For the first Olympics, the first place winners were actually given a silver medal, an olive branch, and a diploma, saying that you were the champion of your event. Second place winners were given a copper medal, a laurel branch, and a diploma as well. And third place were given nothing. They weren't given anything. So they made it to the podium. That was it. That's all they got. This was changed in the future when the IOC made first place gold, second place silver, and third place bronze, and that's what they're considered today for the 1896 games. So after the success of the games, Greece essentially petitioned the IOC in Coubertin to hold all future Olympic games in Greece, in Athens, and they promised to, revamp stadiums, make it bigger, better, that sort of thing. However, Coubertin had already started developing and creating an Olympic Games in his home city of Paris for 1900, so the Olympic Games wouldn't actually return to Greece until much later on. Overall, the Games were a huge success, and that was one of the big reasons why they continued to go all the way up until now. The 1896 Games would eventually morph into the Games that we know today, minus the rope climbing event, but I would be okay with them bringing it back, or just throwing people into the Bay of Z and deciding to let them swim and see if they'll make it. But they were successful. They decided to bring them back, changed it a little bit. They now actually have facilities and stuff, which is great. And actually at the time, it was one of the largest international athletic events and brought a lot of different people together when there was a lot of different stuff going on in the world at the time. And that is the history of the first ever Olympic Games. So thank you for sticking around this long. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you think of some other sport history related topics to do, or if there's another games you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment down below, and also the subscribe button. Yeah, that'd be great too. Thank you. Bye.